Welcome back to GLBC Connections. When I was early in my career, I found myself in a conference room in Baltimore, Maryland. I was there as a young quality manager. We were running some little makeup bottles, and the customer was a little unhappy with them, and we thought unjustifiably. And so my job was to go and convince them that they were misunderstanding what we had done with the bottles, that they were fine, and to have them run the bottles without us having to resort them all. The conference room contained myself, some samples of the bottles, and three people, two young men and an older lady. And we began the conversation, and I had never been there before and didn't really know the customer all that well. They weren't very large. And we began the conversation, and it was the older lady who took all the notes and asked all the questions. And I found myself, as we moved through the meeting, talking directly to her. I'd been trained, I'd been a salesman earlier in my life. I knew that you always wanted to look for the decision maker, that the question was who had the authority to make the decision and talk to that person. And not knowing the customer very well, I was talking to her as she was asking all the questions and taking all the notes, and I would hand her the bottles and she would look at them and seem to be in agreement with me. Well, as you may have guessed by now, she was not the decision maker. She was a secretary just there to take the notes. And I had been talking to the wrong person for the duration of the meeting. And needless to say, I did not win that argument that day. And we took the bottles back and resorted them all and reran them with no trouble. But it highlights the importance of authority. Authority really is about who has the power to do something. In this case, the question was who has the power to run bottles. But there is a larger question about authority within our world, and it is who has the authority to fix things. I think we look to a lot of places for that sort of authority. Certainly in this particular climate, I think politics is one place that we look to install people in authority with the ability to fix the things that we want fixed. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work, does it? And very often we find that that authority that we are so sure will fix everything doesn't actually work out. This is the situation to which Mark writes in Mark chapter 2. I want to look with you at verses 1 through 12. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers there was no room left, not even outside the door, as he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by four of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." So very quickly we see a couple things. One might be a question, which is why were they able to lower him through the roof? Well, roofs in that day actually functioned sometimes as family rooms or places of sleeping in the heat. So there was always stairs up to the roof, or typically stairs up to the roof. And the roofs were made of just mud, stacked and packed onto wooden beams. So it was easy enough to dig through the mud, remove a couple of beams, and lower the man down. So that's why they did what they did. Second thing is a little more puzzling. They come to bring the man for healing, and Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven," which doesn't seem to be quite what anybody's looking for in that moment. And that surprises us. It would not have surprised the people present, however, because sin and illness were closely linked, and closely linked in a very important way. They felt that all of the brokenness in the world was a result of sin. And in that way, they were actually quite correct. And they were correct in a way that I think we often now miss. The fact that the reason there are things like people who are paralyzed, people who can't walk, illnesses in the world, is because we live in a broken world. Well, they linked them sometimes a little too closely, and so they sort of thought that the man's sin and his the fact that he was paralyzed were tightly linked together. In fact, Jesus breaks that connection in other places, but not here. But here he simply says your sins are forgiven because those two things, his sins and him being paralyzed, really were linked in everybody's minds. Well, that raises questions, of course, for everybody watching. In verse 6, we see those. Now that some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, I want you to notice real quickly, the teachers of the law don't doubt that Jesus has met, in at least some sense, the man's need. They don't think he has the right to do it, but they don't question why he would say that as opposed to, hey, you can stand up and walk. That's because they also thought that the sin and the illness were linked closely together. And so even if Jesus didn't have the authority, he said something that they at least thought would be the right thing to do if Jesus in fact could do it. Their problem was they didn't think he could do it. That comes up in verse 8, and Jesus is going to answer that question that they have. Does he have the right to do it? Immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? That question is rhetorical, of course. We all know that the answer is it's easier to say your sins are forgiven if you don't have the authority to back it up. No harm done. Or at least all you've done is maybe tell a little lie. But everybody would know if he didn't have the authority to tell the man to take up his mat and walk. So with that rhetorical question, Jesus continues, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take up your mat, and go home. And the man got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. What happens here? Well, Jesus, in that moment, proves that he has the authority to forgive sins by telling the man that he's healed and executing that healing there in the presence of all those people. In this, Jesus demonstrates his clear authority both to forgive sins and to fix the ills of the world. Those two statements are linked, and they're very important. The ills of the world, the brokenness, the health problems, but other things, economic illnesses, there's all kinds of things about the world that are broken. They are broken because of sin. There is a link between those two things. And as Christians, we need to remember that and think about it. More than that, though, Jesus shows he is the fix for all those problems, both to forgive sins and to heal that which ails the world. In the end, when I spoke to that lady in the conference room, she did not have the authority to solve my immediate problem. That's a question that we bring to the rest of life. Who has the authority to solve our problems? Well, first we have to understand that our most base problem is sin, and Jesus has the authority to solve that problem if we go to him in faith. And secondly, Jesus also has been given the authority to fix everything that's wrong with this world, and someday he will. In the end, Jesus is the one with authority, and all the other places we put our hope and trust don't really work because those things and places, whatever they are, they don't have the authority. So we turn to Jesus. My hope is you'll think about who Jesus is and the authority that he has, and turn to him both for forgiveness of sins and to fix that which is wrong in the world. Because that is our hope, and he is our hope, and he has the authority. Thanks for joining us today.